Our first question is from Becky. So Becky asks, would these guidelines also be applicable for narrative synthesis for exposure data? For example, to synthesize prevalence rate or depression from various populations for reviewers without access to MA software?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we were developing this work, you know, we developed it specifically with intervention reviews in mind. But when we were doing it, we started to realize that the issues that, or the items that we cover, could really be applied to most syntheses, you know, whether or not, you know, in meta-analysis of effect sizes as well. For exposure data, it might be slightly different, but I mean, I think you would maybe want to adapt it a bit, but I think you could, you know, realistically find it as some sort of guidance for you. Yeah.
Okay, terrific. The next question is from Elisa, and Elisa asks, is it possible to combine p-values if the only p-values reported referred to the significance being, for example, less than 0.05? In other words, not an exact number.
I don't think so. I think that would be, yeah, I think you would need exact p-values. I mean, I have to say it's not a method I have ever used, and it's not something that's been used very often, but yeah, I think you would need exact p-values for that. Otherwise, it's just too binary, isn't it?
Terrific. So Simon had a comment. He mentioned, I think this is also true for reviews without meta-analysis, and then he expanded on that and said, this refers to decisions on how to group studies and outcomes for analysis, where reviews focus on interventions that are more complex in one way or another, or the review is focused on an outcome. I think it is often not possible to anticipate all PICO groupings in advance at the protocol stage.
Yeah.
If you like to, yeah.
I would agree. You know, it was interesting in the poll. Some people agreed and disagreed about, you know, very often you end up having to change your planned groupings or comparison groupings. But certainly, my own experience and those of many others that I've had contact with, and the reviews that I see coming through the public health group, it's very common for people to have to rethink their PICO and the specific groupings to make sure the review continues to be able to be useful. You know, you might set out in an ideal world and think we're going to answer these questions, and then when you do the search, you don't find exactly the data that you'd hoped for. So when you make these sort of changes, it's okay to make these changes, but what's really critical is that not only are the changes appropriate to what you found and what the users of the review might be interested in, but also that you are transparent about the changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So our next questions is from editor. So she says, regarding poll question 2, shouldn't we perform a scoping review to be able to propose groupings of interventions or outcomes in the protocol to increase the transparency? So along the same line.
Yeah, you know, that's a really nice sort of thing for discussion, you know, because you're not supposed to know what you're going to find before you go into a review or research. You're supposed to go in with a blank mind in theory, but at the same time you've got to be informed about what you realistically might expect so that you can plan for it. So I think it's almost an impossible question to answer. I think you inevitably need some topic knowledge, and you don't want to end up doing a series of empty reviews. So you maybe should be doing, you know, certainly in the public health group, when we have authors proposing a title, we ask them to to give us examples of studies that would be eligible for inclusion in the review, so that we at least know that they are going to be able to find something. So it's difficult to know exactly how much preparation work must be done. Difficult to be prescriptive about it, I think.
No, absolutely. Our next question is from Yanni. This is a comment. Just a thought, if a measure of variance isn't available, that doesn't necessarily prevent meta-analysis. One can always make assumptions and produce, for example, 3 different meta-analyses based on 3 different assumptions. Better than no no meta-analysis, surely.
Yeah, that's probably right. I mean, there's definitely there's different views about this. Some people say, always meta-analysis no matter what, and then interpret the synthesized data in light of any kind of misgivings that you have. But other people would say, no, it's okay. You shouldn't be determined to meta-analyze in all times. But there's no doubt that a meta-analysis is a very powerful and useful tool, and people would much rather get an effect size than not.
I think it's going to be a really good idea to have this additional session that you're both planning, because it sounds like there's a lot of place for further discussion and sort of there's a lot of it's a fertile area. Mm-hmm. So I really encourage our attendees to think about jumping on that on the next call. Our next question is from Juan Franco. Our review, we have different measurements. In our review, we have different measurements of outcomes, hazard ratio to the X event, and mean differences in the occurrence of X events, and non-exact p-value in differences in rates of an event. Is summarizing the overall effect direction in qualitative statement in a qualitative statement acceptable? For example, adding the supporting data on the direction of the effect.
Yes, and I mean, I'm not a statistician, so I'm not an expert in converting data into a standardized measure. But I have been in situations where, so that we could do some sort of meta-analysis, we converted continuous data into dichotomous or binary data into odds ratios so that we could do sort of a bit more of a meta-analysis. So I don't know if there's something that would be worth doing that, so although you lose some of the detail or the specific statistical measures, you're still able to do a meta-analysis. But what you can also do is when you report, if you think, well, I'd rather just do it on effect direction, because that means we can include all the studies for a particular comparison group. But you could, when you report effect direction, you could also report the actual effect measure, like the hazard ratios or the other measures in the effect direction plot, so that the reader can see a bit more detail.
Terrific. Juan also had an additional question that I think it's a lovely question. What has been the reception of CRGs with regards to SWIM? He continues, considering that many of us may consider using them in published protocols that have not considered them a priori. This is a recently published guide.
Considering that many of us may consider using them in published. Yeah, well, I mean, we've been really kind of pleased with the reception generally. I'm not sure about reception specifically from Cochrane review groups, but I've not really been aware of it not being well received. So yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think
great.
Yeah, it would be good to, within the networks, it's probably quite an interesting issue to discuss. I think there are definitely, CRGs in Cochrane who are much more focused on synthesis of RCT data and doing meta-analysis. But certainly in the public health network, this is a really kind of relevant issue for us, because we can't always do meta-analysis.
So could I just jump in there for a second, Hilary, to say that when we started all this project a couple of years ago, we had a look at what Cochrane reviews were doing, what kind of analysis they were doing, and we found that around 70-75% of the Cochrane review groups seemed to publish reviews that didn't use meta-analysis, so they were using something else, and we would hope that perhaps the SWIM guidance would help with those reviews that do use something else rather than meta-analysis.
And I think one of the things that Vary also identified was that very often in reviews, because the studies included are not identical, either because the outcomes are not exactly the same, or the context is not exactly the same, or the intervention is not exactly the same, that there's not very much synthesis done. So I think you end up with reviews, a lot of reviews that end up just reporting one study in each group, and that's not really a great advantage to the reader, because you may as well just let them read the abstracts of each included study, and yet the amount of work that goes into the reviews, the value is really in the synthesis.